One of the things I enjoy about making videos for the Raven's Eye is that I'm constantly finding out about interesting events about which I had no previous knowledge, and today's video is just such one of those events. It's the first Canadian disaster which I've covered on the channel, and until it was suggested in the comments I'd never even heard of this incident. Now, I admit my knowledge of all things Canadian is mostly limited to what I picked up from my Canadian colleagues while I was working and living in a pub called the Maple Leaf in central London, and that was back during my gap year in the late 1980s. That knowledge pretty much consisted of the following: that there are only really two kinds of beer worth drinking. There's a cool guy called Wayne Gretzky who's very good at ice hockey, Clamato juice is a real thing, and that New Brunswick bacon pie is very tasty. Well, now I have a piece of history to add to that vast array of knowledge. The story of the 1979 train derailment which became known as the Mississauga Miracle. In the late evening of the 10th of November 1979, Canadian Pacific Freight Train 54 was heading into the final leg of its weekly 180-mile run, transporting cargo from Sarnia, which is located on the shores of Lake Huron, to the outskirts of Toronto. However, on this fateful night, Train 54 would not reach its destination. Unbeknownst to the three-man crew on the train, they were about to become involved in an accident that would lead to the single largest emergency evacuation in Canadian history. Canadian Pacific Train 54 had begun its journey on the other side of the American border in Windsor, crossing over into Canada at Sarnia, where it had stopped to take on more freight. By the time it left, the three locomotive engines were pulling an impressive 106 cars of freight. Now, amongst these freight cars were tankers containing propane, butane, caustic soda, and other highly flammable and hazardous materials. And sat right in the middle of them was the cherry on the cake, a tanker carrying 90 tons of liquid chlorine. As the train gathered up speed and headed off into the night, there were no obvious problems. Travelling at around 50 miles an hour, the trip to Toronto should take just over 4 hours, meaning that the train was scheduled to arrive not long after midnight. The crew had done this many times before, and there was no reason to think that this trip would be anything other than just the usual weekly run. Trouble began as the train approached Mississauga, the Canadian city suburb which is situated just to the west of Toronto. A wheel bearing on car 33, which was a tanker carrying flammable toluene, had seized up, leading to a situation that railway engineers call a hotbox. Smoke was billowing from the axle and sparks were flying. The attached set of wheels had started to glow a dull red, and it was just a matter of time before the axle failed and the wheels would, quite literally, come off the wagon. At 11:53 p.m, eyewitness Lynn Riddell, who lived by the rail tracks on Burnhamthorpe Road, saw a pair of red-hot flaming train wheels come crashing through her picket fence, coming to rest in her garden just feet from the house. The train sped on, managing to stay on the tracks for a couple of minutes longer, but at 11:56 p.m, the inevitable happened. At the junction of Mavis Road and Dundas Street, eyewitness Ron Daybor and his wife Kay were approaching the crossing in their car just as Train 54 was passing through. They noticed sparks shooting from the underneath of the passing train, and to their astonishment and horror, the sight of the tanker cars jumping off the tracks and ploughing into one another. In panic, Ron reversed at full speed, losing control and slewing off the road into a ditch just as the first propane tanker exploded, sending a huge fireball some 1,000 feet into the sky. People in Mississauga had no idea what was happening. Many described a scene where night suddenly turned into day and the sky was seemingly on fire. Resident Alfie McCann stated, "I thought it was a nuclear attack. I was sure it was the end. All hell broke loose. The sky was lit up with a huge orange flame." Another witness described seeing a major explosion. "We watched as a tanker car was thrown hundreds of feet into the air. The sky was just burning red." The derailment and the first explosion had ruptured the air hoses on the train, causing the brakes to lock on, and the train had screeched to a halt. The three men in the locomotive, Ted Nicol, engineer Keith Pross, and brakeman Larry Krupa, realised that they were in imminent danger as they saw the first fireball erupt on the train behind them. By now, every first responder in the city was aware that something was going on and they were rushing to the scene. Brakeman Larry Krupa, realising that they still had 20-odd tankers full of propane hitched to the train behind them, leapt from the driver's cab and raced back down the tracks. Now, I'd like to think that I would react in a similar way if I was faced with a situation like this, but I don't know if I could have done what this guy did. Risking almost certain death if another tanker blew, Krupa ran down to the propane car nearest the raging inferno and managed to close the airline valve. This allowed the still hitched propane tankers to be uncoupled from the wreckage so the train could pull them away to a safe distance. It was an act of pure heroism on Krupa's part, and almost undoubtedly saved the remaining tankers from exploding, and who knows how many lives in the process. Just a few minutes after Krupa's mad dash to uncouple the train, a second propane tanker in the wreckage exploded. Witnesses as far away as Niagara Falls saw the flash, thousands of people in Toronto heard the blast, and the explosion was so powerful that it threw a 90-ton freight car some half-mile through the air. Meanwhile, the local firefighters, some of them wearing only tuxedos as they had been at a wedding function earlier that night, were inching closer to the blazing wreckage. The only way to know what hazardous materials they were dealing with was to get close enough to read the codes painted on the side of the burning tankers. Now it was at this point, which is about 1:30 AM, that a horrible realisation dawned. Right in the middle of the raging inferno was the tanker that was holding the 90 tons of liquid chlorine. And that chlorine was now leaking. This put a whole new dimension to the gravity of the situation, as it was quickly established that the leaking chlorine gas, exposed to the extreme heat, could produce phosgene gas. This is very nasty stuff indeed. It had been used extensively during World War I, and the effects were well documented. Itchy eyes, skin irritations, pulmonary edema, and lung failure, which led to death. Phosgene gas accounted for more deaths during World War I than mustard gas, and now the authorities were faced with a nightmare scenario of the possible release of an enormous cloud of the killer gas just a few miles from downtown Mississauga. There was no choice in the matter, they would have to evacuate everybody from the surrounding area. Over the next 24 hours, the fire crews valiantly battled the ongoing blaze, braving a further 3 propane tanker explosions while keeping their hoses trained on the leaking chloride tank in order to prevent this from going up and releasing the dreaded toxic gas cloud. The evacuation zone was expanded time and time again as the wind was now picking up and more areas were placed in the danger zone. Increasing numbers of first responders and volunteers arrived in a seemingly endless stream to help in what had become the greatest mass evacuation of people in the history of North America. Everybody had to go. Families with babies, small children, the elderly, the sick, even hospital patients who were on life support. Nobody was allowed to remain within the designated evacuation zone. By the time midnight rolled around on day 2 of the blaze, almost 250,000 people had been evacuated from the area, and Mississauga was deserted. Overnight, it had become a complete ghost town, apart from the remaining abandoned pets that were roaming the vacant streets, the firemen still fighting the blazing wreckage, and the police who formed a cordon around the empty city. In the words of Mayor Hazel McCallion, Mississauga was closed until further notice. Finally, by the morning of the 3rd day, the fire crews were able to extinguish the last of the burning tankers and declare that the blaze was out. Problems remained, however, as the tanker of liquid chlorine was still disgorging its contents, despite the best efforts of the firemen to patch the ruptured freight car. It took a further 3 days for crews to pump out the remaining 14 tons of liquid left inside. The other 76 tons had either escaped into the atmosphere or had drained into the ground in and around the crash site. But the greatest threat, the release of the phosgene gas, was gone, and residents were allowed to return to their homes only 6 days after the accident. The almost total lack of casualties in what could have been a truly horrific accident led to the train derailment being known as the Mississauga Miracle. but it could have been a different story altogether had the accident occurred in almost any other location. Hazel McCallion, the mayor, stated that if this had have happened half a mile further down the track, either east or west, we would have seen thousands of people wiped out. It's a miracle that it happened here. As it was, the only noted casualty was the mayor herself, who sprained her ankle during her first visit to the crash site and had to be carried to her press conferences thereafter. She went on to serve as mayor for a further 36 years before retiring in 2014, aged 93. Larry Krupa, the heroic brakeman, was inducted into the North American Railway Hall of Fame, and he was also awarded the Order of Canada for his outstanding bravery. For me, it makes a nice change to cover a story like this, because it's rare that you find a disaster story without the accompanying disaster and terrible loss of life. Today, the Mississauga miracle is remembered for that very reason. The 1,000 ways in which it could have all ended in disaster, but thankfully, it didn't. On Saturday, July the 10th, 1976, a chemical reactor at the Seveso chemical plant overheated, allowing for the unintended release of a cloud of material which settled over the small town of Seveso, Italy. The cloud contained toxic chemicals, and although no immediate effects were felt, this event would go on to become one of the worst industrial accidents of modern times. An accident exacerbated by the slow response of the owners of the factory and the local authorities. Located about 10 miles north of Milan, the small picturesque town of Seveso was a popular stopping-off point for lorry drivers heading up into the Alps on the way to Switzerland. Seveso was famous for the tradition of furniture making, but the town also had another less well-known industry, which was chemicals. Located on the outskirts of the small town was the Seveso chemical plant, owned by the Swiss industrial giant Hoffmann La Roche. The factory produced a number of chemical compounds used in fertilisers and herbicides, and it was here, in Building 3 of the factory, that the accident would occur. At the time, Italian law prohibited the production of chemical compounds over the weekends, and so on the afternoon of Friday the 9th of July, when the factory closed for the weekend, the decision was made to leave an unfinished batch of chemicals in the mixing reactor in Building 3. The staff just assumed that the chemical stew would be, okay until Monday morning, when they could start back on the process from where they left off. But, left unattended, without the mixer running, and with no automatic cooling process in place, an unexpected and completely unintended runaway reaction began to take place. By the Saturday afternoon, heat and pressure within the reactor had reached a critical level, and it caused the safety release valve to rupture. This safety valve vented the material outside to prevent an explosion, but there was no provision to contain the chemicals which were released. The result was that people in the area witnessed a reddish-coloured cloud spewing from the vent on the factory roof. The cloud began to drift with the wind, covering the town and moving southwest towards Milan. Puzzled locals watched as the cloud drifted over, wafting down and settling over the town. But no alarms sounded, and nobody panicked. Although the cloud was a bit smelly and it made a few people's eyes sting, nobody thought much of it. As one resident said, "At that time, we didn't pay too much attention to it because there was always some cloud or some leak, and although there was a terrible smell, we didn't worry about it. We ate, we collected vegetables and flowers from the garden, as if nothing had happened." People soon got back to what they were doing. Children carried on playing. After all, it was a lovely summer afternoon. What nobody realised at the time was that an estimated 37,000 people had just been exposed to a massive dose of the poison dioxin. The runaway reaction within Building 3 had produced a small quantity of a chemical called 2378 tetrachlorodibenzodioxin, or TCDD for short. This compound was very similar to an ingredient of the toxic defoliant Agent Orange, which had been used extensively by the US Army during the Vietnam War. This is the same Agent Orange which was later blamed for the high incidence of cancers and illness amongst veterans of that war. Although the cloud contained an estimated 6 tons of material, only around a kilogram of TCDD escaped, but that's enough. The damage was done, and soon symptoms began to emerge. Over the next couple of days, people who were living close to the factory began to get sick with stomach problems. Small animals began to die. Poultry, rabbits, cats and birds were the first to be noticed. Plants began to wither and die, and many of the locals had vegetable plots around the factory, and all of these had been thoroughly contaminated with dioxin. About 36 hours after the accident, the management of the Mississauga factory informed authorities that there had been an accidental release of chemicals which could possibly damage crops, but no mention of dioxin was made. The factory managers were still unsure of what had happened, and they had no idea really what chemicals had been released. As a precautionary measure, the next day locals were advised not to eat any locally grown produce or eat any poultry, and an emergency slaughter of some of the livestock began. The immediate danger was that people would be eating meat from contaminated animals, and over the next few months, an estimated 80,000 animals were slaughtered as a precaution. By day 4, children and some adults were starting to develop skin burns and severe rashes, which developed into chloracne, a truly horrible condition where the skin around the face, armpits and groin erupts into pus-filled boils and swollen and infected skin pores. This awful condition can last for years, even decades, and it's very difficult to treat. The doctors treating the first wave of sick children had no idea what had caused the chloracne, as officials from the Mississauga factory had still not confirmed that dioxin had been released. But by now, officials and the media were speculating that dioxin poisoning was to blame, and seeing how a kilogram of pure dioxin is enough to kill 50,000 people, panic began to set in. Eventually, after almost 2 weeks of exposure, Mississauga officials admitted that in all likelihood dioxin had been released. However, the local officials still did it, holding closed meetings and coming up with half-baked measures to try and reassure the local populace. In the end, it was down to senior chemists from Hoffmann La Roche to convince them that evacuation was necessary, and finally, the order to evacuate was given. The toxic cloud had affected an area of roughly 18 square kilometres, containing a population of around 37,000 people. This area was split into 3 zones, A, B and R, depending on the concentration of dioxin which was to be found in the topsoil. In Zone R, furthest from the site of the leak, farming activities were restricted due to trace elements of dioxin being found in the soil. In Zone B, children and pregnant women were advised to leave due to the elevated risks. Zone A, a 110-hectare area which included most of the central part of Seveso, was completely evacuated and sealed off with a 12-foot-high wire fence. No one was allowed in without special government permission, and no one was allowed to return home. The authorities were unsure of what to do, and it was initially thought that Zone A would have to remain forever sealed off from the rest of Italy. However, a clean-up plan was put into effect to try and minimise the effects of the leak. This clean-up operation took over 5 years to complete. 2 giant steel containers were erected in Zone A, and into these were dumped all the contaminated animal carcasses, the rubble from the demolished buildings, including the demolished Mississauga factory itself, any household goods from Seveso, and hundreds of tons of contaminated topsoil. These 2 steel containers have been encased within giant concrete sarcophagi designed to hold the toxic waste inside for at least 300 years, by which time the levels of dioxin should be harmless. Finally, all of the contaminated protective clothing used by the cleanup crews was packed into 41 barrels, the same type of barrels that are used to store nuclear waste, with the promise from Hoffmann La Roche that this would be disposed of in a responsible manner. In cases like this, it often seems that somehow nobody's ever held responsible. So was anyone ever held to account for the Seveso disaster? Well, the parent company, Hoffmann-La Roche, were forced to pay out millions of dollars in compensation. Exactly how much is unsure, as most of the claims were settled out of court. 5 ICMESA employees were arrested and handed sentences between 2.5 to 5 years, although many of these convictions were reduced or overturned on appeal. However, one man paid a very heavy price for his role in the disaster. In 1980, Paolo Pauletti, the director of production at the ICMESA plant, was shot and killed by a member of the Italian Marxist group Prima Linea, who were protesting as what they saw as uncaring capitalism causing social and environmental damage. Today, Seveso seems to have put its dark past behind it. Zone A and the 2 giant sarcophagi are buried under metres of new soil and are now located within part of the Seveso Oak Forest Park. You can walk through there and have no idea that just a few metres below your feet are the remains of some of the most poisonous materials on Earth. In terms of human costs, it's very difficult to accurately assess the damage done by the dioxin leak, as the long-term effects are practically impossible to trace. The immediate effects were the hospitalisation of hundreds of people suffering chemical burns and chloracne. The long-term effects of liver disease, cancer, respiratory illness are harder to trace due to many residents fleeing the area and never returning. Without doubt, though, the Seveso disaster caused the premature deaths of many, many people. It's just that we'll never truly know how many. In part, the delay and seemingly inept response to the disaster was down to the fact that nobody was sure of just exactly what had been released. It was thought that the creation of TCDD was impossible in the chemical process that was used in the ICMESA plant, and if left to Italian officials alone, it's likely that no evacuation at all would have been undertaken. In a statement from La Roche, they declared that the population of Seveso area was spared grave damages is due to the fact that we compelled the authorities to take seemingly harsh and unpopular measure of evacuating the population from the contaminated area. And so the saga was almost over, but not quite. Remember the promise to dispose of the 41 barrels of sealed waste responsibly? Well, that didn't go quite as planned. La Roche subcontracted the work to an independent contractor, Mannesmann Italia, who agreed to dispose of the waste on the condition that La Roche didn't ask where it would be going. And in September 1982, the 41 barrels left the Seveso Zone A, bound for an undisclosed location, supposedly to be incinerated. However, an investigative TV show had followed the route of the barrels to Saint-Quentin in northern France, where the trail ran cold. The barrels were gone. It turned out that the subcontractors, Mannesmann, had themselves passed the waste on to a third party, again on the condition that they didn't want to know where it was going. And by now, nobody seemed to know where the barrels were or what had happened to them. Eventually, in May 1983, the barrels were discovered sitting unattended in an abandoned slaughterhouse in a small rural village in northern France. This public embarrassment forced La Roche to take responsibility and clean up the last of their mess. In 1985, the barrels were finally incinerated at a La Roche facility in Switzerland, a full 9 years after the ICMESA dioxin leak at Seveso. It was the last step in the clean-up of the event, which was nicknamed at the time Italy's Hiroshima. Whilst making videos for the Raven's Eye, I've come across many stories where it seems that everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and at the worst possible moment. Today's story is one of those, and involves some very unlucky people who were doing nothing more dangerous than having a camping holiday in the summertime. Now, sometimes you might have an inkling that you are in a potentially dangerous situation. like being in a crowded nightclub that's filled with flammable material and's got only one exit that's a turnstile, or you're working in a hazardous LPG plant that's got leaking pipework. But sitting down to have lunch next to your tent or caravan in an open campground is just not one of those situations. And yet it seems that tragedy can strike anywhere and at any time, as the unfortunate guests of the Los Alfaques campsite were to find out on the 11th of July, 1978. The Los Alfaques campsite is located on the Spanish coast just a few kilometres south of the small town of La Rapita, sandwiched on a narrow strip between the sea and the adjacent N340 coastal road. And on that sunny Tuesday in 1978, it was absolutely packed. Now, the official maximum occupancy of the site was 260 people, but due to a couple of unregistered extensions and being popular with day trippers to the coast, it's estimated that anywhere between 800 to 1,000 people were inside the campground or on the beach by the campsite that day. Countdown to this tragedy began earlier that day 100 kilometres up the coast as 50-year-old truck driver Francisco Villena arrived at the En Petrol refinery outside Tarragona to pick up his cargo. On that day he would be hauling a consignment of the highly flammable gas propene in his tanker. His destination was Puerto Llano, located south of Ciudad Real, some 600 kilometres away. Normally he would have had a co-driver for a journey of this duration, but for some reason he was travelling alone. And that wasn't the only thing wrong with that situation. The tanker was overfilled, carrying around 24.5 tonnes of propane, which was more than 4 tonnes over the maximum allowed capacity. Also, the tanker had no emergency relief valve installed, something which should have been compulsory for hauling this kind of flammable cargo. Regardless of these obvious hazards, Francisco Villena set off anyway, leaving the refinery at around 11 o'clock in the morning. It was a hot, sunny day, and the propane inside the tank would have already been heating up, expanding and therefore increasing the pressure on the walls of the steel tanker. Now, instead of taking the A7 coastal motorway, Villena opted to follow the narrow, winding N340 which hugged the coastline, passing through many busy little towns along the way. Just a couple of hours later, at around 2:35 p.m, as the truck was passing the crowded Los Alfaques campsite, something happened, something which caused the truck to come to a stop in the middle of the road. Now, accounts vary as to exactly what it was that did happen. Some reports state that the truck suffered a blowout, lost control and hit the campground wall, rupturing the tank in the process. Other accounts say that the loud bang that was heard was in fact the tank rupturing due to too much pressure and that the driver just pulled over to investigate. Either way, by 2:35 p.m, the tanker had come to a complete halt outside the Los Alfaques campground and was spewing out propane. As the flammable liquid escaped, it became a gas, forming a thick white fog, which quickly blanketed the area around the truck and began spreading out, drifting into the campground and across the road towards nearby houses and buildings. Curious campers looked up from their chairs and their picnic tables, and what was that? Fog? Surely not on a day like this. And then the gas found an ignition source, and Los Alfaques campsite became hell on earth. The ensuing explosion tore the truck in two, flinging the cabin and the ruptured tank hundreds of metres in opposite directions. This massive explosion created a fireball with an estimated diameter of at least 100 metres and temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. The fireball devastated a large part of the campground, the blast wave and searing heat instantly killing anyone in close proximity. Others, burning but alive, ran to the sea to try and put out the flames that covered them, but it was no use as the sea was literally boiling. Cars and gas bottles exploded, creating secondary fires, trapping injured campers who'd survived the initial blast. The main campsite building had been flattened, killing everyone inside. Caravans melted in the intense heat, and tents were just set ablaze. In the immediate aftermath, it was complete chaos. Injured and dazed campers wandered through a scene of total devastation. Fires raged as survivors stumbled over bodies which littered the ground. Now, people who lived nearby and had witnessed the blast rushed to help, many driving the burn survivors to hospitals in their own cars and vans. The first ambulances arrived at around 3, and the fire brigade finally turned up at around 3:30. They took almost an hour to arrive. The initial explosion had killed 158 people, including the driver, Francisco Villena, but many more were to succumb to their injuries in the following hours and days. The final death toll is officially listed at 217, but 270 fatalities is the accepted higher figure, taking into account those who died later, some suffering months of agony in the burn wards of hospitals before dying. The process of identifying the dead was long and arduous, and it was feared that many of the dead would remain unidentified. The majority of the victims were German, Belgian, French, Dutch and British, and many had checked in unofficially with no ID. However, after weeks of painstaking and traumatic work, only 2 bodies remained unidentified. So the inquiry into the Los Alfaques disaster established the following failings. First, the tanker was overloaded with propane by around 4 tons. In this situation, there was no room for any expansion, and on a hot, sunny day, increased pressure inside the tank was inevitable. Secondly, the tanker wasn't designed to transport flammable gases or liquids. In addition, it had previously carried loads which had corroded and weakened the steel, again lending credence to the theory that the tank had ruptured prior to the truck coming to a halt. Third, overloading of tankers was seemingly common practice at the Petrol refinery. Accurate loading instruments were not available, and as a cost-cutting measure, tankers tended to be overfilled rather than being sent off under the maximum capacity. And fourth, driver Francisco Villena, he did no hazmat driver training. He's not informed of what cargo he was carrying, or nor was he informed of the fact that the tanker was probably overloaded. Now, as to why Villena chose to drive on the windy, narrow and busy N340 instead of the A7 motorway, this was almost certainly a question of saving money by not paying the motorway tolls. Patrol refused to admit that they had any responsibility for the accident, arguing that they held no sway over what route the driver decided to take. Although witnesses later testified to overhearing Villena arguing vehemently with an Patrol manager about money for motorway tolls being withheld. Now, it seems to me that there were failings all round, but what's almost certain is that if Villena had taken the motorway instead of the busy local road, the death toll from this explosion would be drastically reduced. In light of the inquiry's findings, daytime transportation of hazardous cargo through heavily populated areas was prohibited. In the end, 6 Patrol employees were convicted of criminal negligence and sentenced to between 1 and 4 years in prison, although on appeal, all of these sentences were either suspended or reduced. Patrol settled out of court to the families of the victims to the tune of around, in today's money, €62 million. As for the Los Alfaques campsite, it was back in business by Christmas 1978, and it's still there to this day, although now it's called El Alfaques. The name changes apparently in a bid to distance themselves from the 1978 tragedy, which many would-be guests stumble upon when Googling for the campsite online. Although this is a horrific tragedy in its own right, 270 people were killed and hundreds more injured and scarred for life, it's worth remembering that, in fact, it could have been much worse. If the tanker had have exploded just 3 kilometres earlier, as it was passing through the busy seaside resort of La Rapita, it's possible that the death toll could have been counted in the thousands. That, of course, is no comfort to the men, women and children who perished so horribly that day in July 1978. A hot summer's day, a day like any other in a relaxing summer holiday, but a day that turned into hell on earth for the guests of the Los Alfaques campsite. On the 1st of June 1974, a huge explosion ripped through the Nypro chemical works in Flixborough, killing 28 people and wounding 80 others. The blast was heard up to 60 kilometres away, and buildings up to 15 kilometres away were damaged. It was one of the worst industrial accidents that Britain had ever seen, and was the largest peacetime explosion in British history. The Nypro chemical works were situated just outside the small village of Flixborough, in a rural part of northern England. Originally begun as a Fison's chemical plant making fertiliser, it had been revamped and expanded during the 1960s. The site was vast and produced many raw chemicals to be used in factories around the UK. One of the chemicals it produced was caprolactam, which was used in the manufacture of nylon, a very popular synthetic material widely used during the 1970s. The production of caprolactam involved a process whereby a chemical called cyclohexane was oxidised by injecting compressed air. To do this, the chemicals were run through 6 linked reactors, which were kept under pressure, and it was in this part of the plant that the disaster would occur. During a routine inspection, Reactor 5 was found to be unsafe as a large crack had appeared in the outer steel sheathing. Production was halted and Reactor 5 was removed to undergo repairs. It was now that the fatal mistake was made. Instead of halting production and waiting for the number 5 reactor to be repaired, a decision was made to continue production. A simple bypass pipe would be fitted, linking reactors 4 and 6 together. A 20-inch steel pipe with flexible ends called bellows was installed. A nest of scaffolding was erected beneath the pipe to take the weight, and after a quick pressure test, production resumed. At 4:53 in the afternoon of Saturday, June the 1st, this temporary bypass pipe ruptured. It's estimated that between 20 to 40 tonnes of cyclohexane gas was released, forming a dense white cloud. Any workers who witnessed the leak ran for their lives. About 30 seconds after the rupture, the spreading cyclohexane cloud encountered a flame, and the whole mass ignited instantaneously. The resulting explosion completely destroyed the chemical plant and sent out a shockwave which caused damage up to 15 kilometres away. Roofs were ripped off houses, windows were blown in, furniture smashed, people thrown around like rag dolls. Cars in the car park were thrown up into the air and landed as twisted wrecks. Clocks in damaged houses were frozen to the instant of the blast. In Grimsby, a fishing town 60 kilometres away, people heard the sound of the explosion, many saying it sounded like loud thunder. Large parts of heavy metal pipework were found up to 6 kilometres away, and small pieces of debris from the factory were found up to 32 kilometres away. It was Britain's biggest peacetime explosion, and it's estimated to have been the equivalent of the detonation of 280 tonnes of TNT. 28 people in the control room of the plant died instantly, and another 36 workers were injured. Beyond the boundaries of the chemical works there were thankfully no further fatalities, although hundreds of people were injured, mostly from flying glass or from being thrown through the air by the force of the blast. Although tragic, the loss of life was limited as it was the weekend and the plant was running a reduced staff. If the explosion had occurred during the week, there would have been around 500 people on site, and the death toll would have undoubtedly been many times higher. The emergency services arrived quickly, but faced with a scene of almost total devastation inside the plant, their efforts were in vain. Unable to quench the flames, the fires burned for 10 days, belching huge clouds of black, noxious smoke into the air. People in the immediate area were evacuated to temporary shelters, and the injured were ferried to hospitals in the nearest towns. An immediate inquiry was set up, but ultimately was unable to pinpoint the actual cause of the blast. There was eyewitness testimony to the fact that the bypass pipe had failed, so how the explosion occurred was not in doubt, but no conclusion could be reached as to exactly why. The most plausible theory was that the bends within the bypass pipe caused repeated flexing under pressure, which eventually led to the rupture due to metal fatigue. However, engineers were not able to replicate this failure, so to this day, uncertainty remains. Despite opposition from members of the public who lived in the local area, The plant was subsequently rebuilt and resumed production. However, as time passed, the demand for nylon began to decline, and the plant became no longer cost-effective to operate. It closed down in 1981 and was eventually demolished. An industrial estate now occupies the land. In the gardens of the small church in Flixborough, there is a memorial plaque to those who died. It's never easy to say that there's anything lucky about a disaster like this, but there can be no doubt that had the accident occurred during the working week, the death toll would have been much, much worse. So for that, I suppose one has to be thankful in some way. On a side note, the Flixborough disaster was also the instance of one of Britain's best-known cases of premonition. The story goes like this. On the morning of the disaster, Mrs. Leslie Brennan was at home in Cleethorpes watching the television. She remembered that the movie was interrupted by a news flash announcing that an explosion had ripped through the Flixborough Nypro plant and that several people had died. She distinctly remembers the words "news flash" appearing on the television screen and a man's voice relaying the information. About noon, two friends paid her a visit, and she asked them if they'd heard about the accident, which of course they hadn't. When later on they were listening to the news about the explosion, the three women thought at first that the newsreaders were stating the details incorrectly, but a check of the paper the next day showed the actual time of the explosion. Whatever strange thing had happened, the three friends maintained that she told them of the accident almost 5 hours before it actually happened. Although impossible to prove, her story was widely reported at the time due to the corroboration of the two friends. Brennan herself could offer no explanation to the strange event. It seems unlikely she made it up. She just didn't seem the kind of person that was seeking attention, and to this day, the strange event remains a mystery.